Imagine walking into a house you've entered hundreds of times before. The television is still playing. A man is lying on the couch exactly where you left him hours earlier. At first, nothing seems unusual. Then you notice the pillow covering his face, and beneath it, blood. Within minutes, deputies would discover something even more disturbing. Not one victim, not two, but 3 people murdered inside the same home. And investigators would soon realize these killings had not happened all at once. Someone had been dead for nearly 2 days before anyone knew. How could 3 roommates be executed inside the same property without the others realizing what had happened? And why would a 23-year-old woman who had lived there for only a month become the center of one of Virginia's most chilling homicide investigations? This is not simply the story of a triple murder. It is the story of warning signs, hidden evidence, and a timeline investigators had to reconstruct almost minute by minute. Because by the time police entered the house, the killer was already hundreds of miles away. June 4th, 2024, Spotsylvania County, Virginia. Just outside Fredericksburg sits a quiet rural neighborhood where gravel roads stretch between modest homes surrounded by trees. It is the kind of place where neighbors wave at each other, where violent crime is almost unheard of. Nothing about White Street Court suggested it would soon become the center of a statewide manhunt. At approximately 10:30 that evening, deputies from the Spotsylvania County Sheriff's Office were dispatched for what initially appeared to be a routine welfare check. These calls happen every day. Someone fails to answer the phone. A family member becomes concerned. A friend notices unusual behavior. Most welfare checks end with relief. This one would become a homicide investigation before officers had even finished searching the first room. The call had come from one of the residents of the house. Earlier that afternoon, he had briefly returned home during lunch. He noticed one of his roommates, Robert McGuire, sitting on the couch exactly as he often did while watching television. Nothing seemed immediately alarming. Robert was older. He often rested in the living room. The roommate assumed he was asleep. He left again and returned to work. Nearly 9 hours later, he came back. Robert had never moved. The television was still on. The position of his body had not changed. But something else had. A strong odor had begun filling the house. As he stepped closer, he saw blood beneath a pillow resting over Robert's head. Instead of touching anything else, he backed away and called 911. It was a decision investigators would later say preserved critical evidence. Deputies arrived expecting uncertainty. Instead, they immediately recognized they were entering an active and potentially dangerous crime scene. As officers approached the front door, they could already sense something was terribly wrong. The house was unusually quiet. No voices, no movement. Only the faint sound of a television continuing to play inside. When deputies confirmed Robert had suffered what appeared to be a fatal gunshot wound, the operation changed instantly. No one knew whether the shooter was still inside. Officers began clearing the home room by room, moving carefully through narrow hallways with weapons drawn. Every closed door represented another unknown. Every corner carried the possibility of an armed suspect waiting inside. Then came the second discovery. Inside a bathroom, deputies found another victim, a woman later identified as Carol Reese. She had also suffered fatal gunshot wounds. There was no weapon nearby, no indication she had been able to defend herself. At that moment, investigators already knew they were dealing with something far more calculated than a single act of violence. But the house still held another secret. As deputies continued searching the property, they stepped outside toward a detached garage. Before anyone even opened the door, experienced officers noticed familiar signs. The smell, the flies, the unmistakable indicators that death had been present there much longer. Hidden beneath objects inside the garage lay the third victim, Gregory Powell. Unlike the other 2 victims inside the house, Gregory's body showed signs he had been dead significantly longer. That single discovery would completely change the direction of the investigation. This wasn't one shooting. This wasn't one argument that suddenly turned deadly. The timeline was now far more complicated. Someone had killed one victim, continued living inside the same house, and then returned later to kill again. For investigators, that raised a terrifying question. If Gregory had been dead for days, what had been happening inside that house during the hours before anyone called police? And where was the 5th roommate? Because one person living in that house was suddenly nowhere to be found. Her name was Alyssa Venable. Within hours, she would become the focus of one of Virginia's largest homicide investigations. By midnight, investigators had secured the property. 3 victims, 3 gunshot deaths, 1 missing roommate, and almost no clear explanation for how any of it had unfolded. At first glance, detectives considered the possibility of a home invasion. 3 executions inside one residence could easily point toward robbery, retaliation, or someone targeting the occupants. But as crime scene technicians began documenting the house, that theory quickly started to fall apart. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows appeared intact. Furniture wasn't overturned. Nothing suggested a violent struggle had taken place throughout the home. Instead, the victims appeared to have been caught completely off guard. That immediately shifted investigators' attention toward someone the victims probably knew, someone who could move freely inside the house without raising suspicion. To understand what had happened, detectives first needed to understand the people living there. The property was a shared residence where several unrelated adults rented rooms. It wasn't a family home. Each resident had their own routine, their own schedule, and often spent much of the day apart from one another. That arrangement would unknowingly create the perfect environment for a killer to hide what had happened. The oldest resident was 77-year-old Robert McGuire, a Vietnam veteran known by friends for his kindness and volunteer work. During the holiday season, he often dressed as Santa Claus for local community events. Neighbors described him as quiet, dependable, and generous. Next was 65-year-old Carol Reese. She also dedicated much of her time to helping others through charitable work. Friends later told investigators she was compassionate and enjoyed caring for people in need. The third victim, Gregory Powell, was a 60-year-old Navy veteran. He kept mostly to himself and rarely attracted attention. Nothing in the backgrounds of these three victims suggested they had enemies or were involved in criminal activity. There was no obvious motive linking them. Then there was the youngest resident, 23-year-old Alyssa Jane Venable. Unlike the others, she had only moved into the house about a month earlier. Most of the victims barely knew her, and that fact would later become one of the most unsettling parts of the case. Detectives now turned their attention to reconstructing every movement inside the house over the previous 48 hours. The first clue came not from forensic evidence, but from Gregory Powell's body. The medical examiner's preliminary observations indicated Gregory had likely died well before Robert and Carol. His level of decomposition was noticeably more advanced. That meant Gregory may have been dead for 1 or even 2 days before deputies discovered him. If that timeline was correct, investigators faced an almost unbelievable possibility. Someone had been murdered inside the garage, while the remaining roommates continued living on the property. How was that possible? Detectives began interviewing the surviving roommate in detail. He explained that everyone generally kept to themselves. People worked different schedules. It wasn't unusual to go a day without seeing another resident. Gregory's absence hadn't immediately raised alarm. That simple detail suddenly became critically important. The shared living arrangement may have allowed the killer to hide the first murder without anyone realizing a crime had already occurred. Investigators then focused on Robert McGuire. The roommate who discovered the bodies told detectives he had briefly returned home around lunchtime earlier that day. Robert was sitting on the couch watching television. Or at least, that's what it looked like. He called out to him. There was no response, but Robert often fell asleep while watching TV. Nothing seemed unusual enough to justify concern. Looking back later, investigators realized Robert was almost certainly already dead. The witness had unknowingly walked into a murder scene and left again without realizing it. That revelation haunted detectives. If the roommate had arrived just a little earlier, could he have encountered the killer? Could he have become another victim? Or had the murderer already left? Those questions had no immediate answers. Crime scene technicians continued documenting every room. Shell casings recovered inside the residence suggested the victims had been shot at close range. Robert had suffered a fatal gunshot wound while seated on the couch. A pillow had been placed over his head. Investigators considered whether it had been used to reduce the sound of the gunshot or simply to conceal the horrific injury afterward. Carol Reese was found inside the bathroom. Evidence indicated she had been shot there. The locations of both victims suggested neither had been expecting violence. Neither appeared to have attempted to flee. Neither showed obvious signs of a prolonged struggle. Whoever pulled the trigger likely caught them completely by surprise. Outside, Gregory Powell's body had been concealed beneath items stored in the detached garage. That concealment told investigators something equally important. The killer hadn't acted in panic. Someone had taken time to hide the body. That suggested planning, not impulse. Then another question emerged. If the murders occurred over 2 separate periods, where had the killer been in between? Living inside the same house? Sleeping there? Eating meals alongside future victims? The evidence increasingly suggested that possibility. And if that was true, the crimes were far more calculated than investigators had initially believed. Meanwhile, detectives were receiving information from another direction. Friends of Alyssa Venable had started contacting law enforcement. They weren't calling to ask if she was safe. They were calling because of what she had said before disappearing. Those conversations would completely change the investigation. Within hours, detectives would shift from asking where Alyssa was to asking how quickly they could find her before anyone else was killed. As detectives worked through the night, the physical evidence began telling a story. Not a complete story, but enough to narrow the investigation dramatically. Every crime scene leaves behind two kinds of evidence: the evidence investigators can collect, and the evidence left behind by human behavior. In this case, both pointed toward the same person. The first breakthrough came from the house itself. Investigators recovered .22 caliber shell casings from the crime scene. The victims had all been shot with what appeared to be the same firearm. But there was one major problem. The gun wasn't there. That immediately ruled out the possibility of a murder-suicide. Someone had taken the weapon and left. Whoever committed these murders had enough awareness to remove the most important piece of evidence before fleeing. That suggested planning, not panic. Crime scene analysts continued documenting every inch of the residence. There was surprisingly little evidence of a struggle. Furniture remained in place. Personal belongings appeared untouched. Nothing suggested the victims had fought desperately for their lives. Instead, investigators believed each victim had been caught completely off guard. That conclusion matched the positions in which they were found. Robert McGuire remained on the living room couch. The television was still running. Carol Reese was found inside the bathroom. Gregory Powell had been hidden beneath items inside the detached garage. The locations were different, but the pattern was remarkably similar. Each victim appeared isolated, separated from the others, killed one at a time. That wasn't random. It suggested someone deliberately controlled when and where each attack occurred. Detectives then began examining the timeline alongside witness interviews. The surviving roommate had unknowingly walked through the house earlier that day without recognizing a murder had already taken place. That meant the killer had a significant window of time to leave the property before police were ever called. The question was simple. Who was missing? Only one resident could not be located. 23-year-old Alyssa Jane Venable. Initially, investigators couldn't determine whether she had fled or whether she had become another victim somewhere else. Then the phone call started. Friends contacted the sheriff's office with information that immediately raised alarms. According to multiple witnesses, Alyssa had appeared unexpectedly earlier that day. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't frightened. Instead, she was trying to make arrangements. One friend told investigators Alyssa had dropped off her dog without offering any real explanation. Another reported receiving a package containing cash, account passwords, and written instructions for caring for the dog. Those actions didn't look like someone leaving for a vacation. They looked like someone preparing never to come back. Even more disturbing were the notes she allegedly left behind. According to witnesses interviewed by investigators, the writing suggested she had hurt people. At the time, detectives had not yet publicly identified a suspect. But those statements immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Friends also revealed something else. Alyssa owned a handgun inherited from a family member. Investigators didn't yet know whether it was the murder weapon. But now they had a missing resident, a missing firearm, and statements indicating she may have confessed before disappearing. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Detectives quickly expanded their background investigation. What they found painted an increasingly troubling picture. Alyssa had only recently moved into the shared house. Before that, she had reportedly lived in several other places, often leaving after conflicts with roommates or family members. Investigators also learned she had been arrested only weeks earlier following an alleged assault involving a coworker. The charge itself did not prove she was capable of murder, but it demonstrated a recent history of violent behavior. Former coworkers described sudden mood swings. Several people said she could become angry with little warning. Others remembered arguments that escalated far beyond what seemed reasonable. None of those accounts proved guilt. But taken together, they helped detectives understand why friends immediately contacted law enforcement after hearing Alyssa's comments. Then investigators uncovered another critical detail. Her vehicle was missing. A statewide alert was issued almost immediately. Authorities identified the car as a Honda Civic and distributed Alyssa's photograph to agencies across Virginia and neighboring states. The investigation had changed overnight. This was no longer only a homicide case. It had become a manhunt. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued processing the crime scene. The medical examiner's findings reinforced what detectives had already suspected. Gregory Powell had likely been killed well before Robert McGuire and Carol Reese. That meant the suspect had remained free and potentially continued living in the same house after the first killing. For investigators, that realization was deeply unsettling. It suggested patience, planning, and a willingness to wait before striking again. Then came another question. If Alyssa had already fled Virginia, where was she going? Investigators began tracing every possible lead. Traffic cameras, witness sightings, financial activity, phone records. Each new clue extended the search farther from Spotsylvania County. The trail would eventually lead hundreds of miles north. And when law enforcement finally located Alyssa Venable, the investigation would enter its most dangerous phase yet, because she wasn't willing to surrender quietly. By the morning of June 5th, investigators believed they knew who they were looking for. The challenge now was finding her. A statewide alert had already been issued. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states received Alyssa Venable's photograph, vehicle description, and information linking her to the triple homicide in Spotsylvania County. But there was one problem. Nobody knew where she was headed. Investigators quickly learned that Alyssa had left behind one of her phones. At first, detectives hoped it would provide real-time location data. Instead, it became another dead end. The phone was no longer traveling with her. Whether intentionally abandoned or accidentally left behind, it offered no immediate path to her location. Detectives shifted their focus to witness statements. Friends described unusual conversations in the hours before the murders were discovered. Several recalled Alyssa acting strangely. Others remembered her speaking as though she expected never to return. The dog she had entrusted to friends suddenly became another important piece of the timeline. People preparing for a short trip rarely hand over passwords, money, personal belongings, and instructions for the future. Those actions suggested preparation, not panic. Meanwhile, investigators continued searching her digital footprint. Financial records, vehicle sightings, license plate readers. Every possible clue was examined. Then, hundreds of miles away from Virginia, investigators finally received the lead they had been waiting for. Authorities believed Alyssa's vehicle had entered western New York. Law enforcement agencies coordinated quickly. The objective was clear: locate the vehicle, stop it safely, and take the suspect into custody before anyone else was harmed. When officers finally spotted the Honda Civic, they attempted a traffic stop. Instead of pulling over, Alyssa accelerated. What followed transformed a homicide investigation into a high-speed pursuit. The chase stretched across highways at speeds reportedly exceeding 100 miles per hour. Troopers carefully weighed every decision. Ending the pursuit too early could allow a triple murder suspect to disappear again. Pushing too aggressively could place innocent motorists in danger. Eventually, officers deployed tire deflation devices. The Honda struck them. Control of the vehicle rapidly deteriorated. Moments later, the pursuit ended when the car crashed into a guardrail. Even then, the danger wasn't over. Officers had no way of knowing whether the suspect was armed, whether additional victims were inside the vehicle, or whether she intended to force another confrontation. Commands were shouted repeatedly. Hands outside the window. Turn off the engine. Do not move. After several tense moments, officers secured the scene and placed Alyssa Venable under arrest. Only then could investigators safely search the vehicle. Inside, detectives recovered what they believed to be one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. A .22 caliber handgun, the same caliber consistent with evidence recovered from the murder scene. The firearm would later become a key part of the prosecution's case. But the search uncovered something else investigators hadn't expected. Documents, personal belongings, and evidence suggesting Alyssa had been preparing for a much longer journey. Detectives now faced another unsettling question. Was she simply trying to escape? Or had she been driving toward another destination with another plan already forming? As investigators interviewed friends, relatives, and eventually reviewed statements gathered after her arrest, a disturbing picture began to emerge. According to evidence later presented in court, investigators believed the 3 murders were not intended to be the end. They believed Alyssa had considered targeting additional people after leaving Virginia. Those alleged future plans became an important part of understanding how investigators viewed the case, not as an emotional outburst, but as an evolving series of planned acts of violence. Still, one question remained unanswered. Why these victims? Robert McGuire, Carol Reese, Gregory Powell. None appeared to have ongoing conflicts with Alyssa. None had criminal histories suggesting retaliation. There was no financial dispute, no obvious revenge motive, no evidence that any of them had threatened her. That absence of a clear motive became one of the most unusual aspects of the investigation. Prosecutors would later argue that the victims were chosen not because of who they were, but because they were available, people who opened their home to a new roommate, people who never imagined the greatest danger inside the house was living just down the hallway. As detectives continued building the case, forensic evidence, witness interviews, surveillance records, and physical evidence recovered after the arrest began reinforcing one another. Individually, each piece answered only part of the puzzle. Together, they reconstructed nearly every step investigators believed had occurred inside the house. Months later, Alyssa Venable pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder. The plea meant investigators would never have to prove every detail before a jury, but it also meant many of the deepest questions would likely never receive complete answers. Why Gregory was killed first. What finally triggered the attacks on Robert and Carol. What was happening inside Alyssa's mind during those 48 hours? Those answers may never be fully known. What is known is this: 3 people who had served their communities, lived quiet lives, and expected the safety of their own home never had the opportunity to defend themselves. A simple welfare check uncovered one of Virginia's most disturbing homicide scenes in recent memory. And behind nearly every piece of evidence was the same lesson investigators often repeat after tragedies like this. Sometimes the biggest warning signs are only recognized after it's already too late. If this case shows us anything, it's that understanding a crime isn't just about identifying the person responsible. It's about following every piece of evidence until the entire story comes into focus. Because in this investigation, the evidence didn't just identify a suspect. It revealed a timeline far more disturbing than anyone first imagined.